Bar.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much again to CIP family for organizing this. Thank you very much also Kathy for this. It's always a pleasure for me to talk about anything other than Duterte and what is the last thing he said.
We're not getting away. We're getting
it was actually within that context that, just a shameless plug-in, I wrote about the BRI project, a new report, 21st Century Silk Road. Of course, for some of you who are familiar with this, we know that the ancient Silk Road was neither about silk only, nor was it a road. And we know that it was not really coming from China. It was really a spontaneous process of trade between Middle East, Europe, and China. Well, the thing is this, I felt it's very important for us, especially in Southeast Asia and the near neighborhood or peripheral neighbors of China, to talk about it. Because I believe that the epistemic community and the discursive dynamics have actual policy impact. I remember in 2012 and 2013, when discussion of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank came out, there was a lot of conspiracy theory that this is a way to challenge the World Bank, this is a new Trojan horse by China to dominate other countries. And at the beginning, actually, we had certain doubts about China's intentions, and a lot of us engaged in track 1.5 discussions with our Chinese counterparts in media and so on and so forth. And the eventual outcome of the AIB was something that I think the President Jean of the AIB very eloquently put it. He said, you can be world-class without necessarily be Western. Right, so if you look at the outcome of the AIB today, it's much closer to what we would want outside the usual suspects of IMF, World Bank, and ADB. And that is why I feel it's very important for us to have these discussions, because the same kind of fluidity and flexibility we saw in Chinese planning of the AIB is very present on BRI, except it's on steroids, right, in terms of size, in terms of ambitions. And we also know that the AIB is also very much connected to Xi Jinping's cult of personality. He very much puts himself at the center of this project as part of his national rejuvenation kind of ambition. But the fact of the matter is that if you talk about the BRI, and if you understand Chinese statecraft, you can never really separate economics from geopolitics. So if you really try to understand how the Chinese are approaching it, there are actually two themes. There is the theme of internal economic rebalancing, and the other hand, of course, you cannot deny that China is also trying to seek geopolitical influence. Now, in terms of internal economic rebalancing, we know that China is suffering from a lot of overcapacity in terms of production of steel and cement and all. What caught my attention during my research on China was they have actually overcapacity in the productive capacity itself also, right? So you had the situation whereby Li Keqiang would go around ASEAN countries and saying, we're not only going to give you cement and steel, we're going to give you the factory itself, right? Because we just have too many factories and productive capacities. So for a time, there was even a discussion of actually industrial export from China. Not just the product, but the procedure itself, which actually excited a lot of countries. Because if you remember, Southeast Asia in the 1980s and 90s, this is where the tiger cub economies were coming out. And then when China entered the global economy and entered the World Trade Organization, a lot of low-end manufacturing shifted out of Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, and went to China. So we kind of paid the price for China's manufacturing. I mean, you can argue about the zero-sum nature of it, but if you look at the FDI flows, and you look at the migration of low-end manufacturing, China benefited more from Southeast Asia. So there's a hope that right now that at least China can kind of give it back to us and help us to rebuild again our manufacturing base. Because only through manufacturing you can perhaps create the kind of well-paying jobs on a large enough scale. But, so there's that aspect of that. There's also, of course, the aspect of China trying to develop the hinterlands and western regions, which, by the way, of course, is politically sensitive too, because here is where you have the Uyghurs, or in Turkish they call Uyghur, right? And of course the Tibetan and so on and so forth. And the reality is that since the time of Wen Jiabao, there was a lot of focus in terms of development of hinterlands to close their gap with the coastal regions. But if you look at the numbers, the contribution of hinterlands to the overall GDP of China barely moved in the past 15 years, from around 16, 17% to barely 18%. And by every indicator, whether it's market openness, GDP per capita, and productivity, they're way below the national average if you look at the numbers of Xinjiang, for instance, or Tibet, and so on and so forth. So the belt part is very much about helping this region to be integrated into a broader global network of production. And that is why the corridors to Pakistan, the infrastructure going through Central Asia and Middle East are important, because they see it as a way to develop this region. And if you look at it, the BRI is actually now incorporated into the internal economic planning of China. It's not seen only as an external strategy, but also as an internal strategy. More than that, of course, state-owned enterprises. We know that over the past 2 years, 1.6 million people have been laid off in some of the SOEs, and the situation was way worse in the past. And of course, this is again a politically sensitive issue, a lot of people losing their jobs. At the same time, you have a president like Xi Jinping who wants to make these SOEs globally competitive, and you had the go outside strategy in the 1990s. So, and we see that in the BRI projects, more than 90% of the projects are going to Chinese SOEs. So this is a way also for the SOEs to find projects abroad and move up the value chain. So there are a lot of economic factors behind that, but there are also political factors behind that. Clearly, if you look at the selection of countries, this kind of ports along the Indian Ocean, it's hard not to imagine as kind of a string of pearl kind of a strategy of China trying to have access to important locations around the region, whether it's in Sri Lanka, it's in Bangladesh, whether it's in Gwadar in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, China, by investing in the infrastructure of other countries, well, I don't buy what Obama said, that China just builds like a road from the mine to the port and to Shanghai. Maybe that's a little bit of a cartoonish portrayal, but the reality is that a lot of this infrastructure investment are concentrated in extractive industries and resource-rich countries, which also gives China a sense of security about its future. And of course, as China invests in other countries, the implication is that these countries are going to have more interdependence with China. And of course, by extension, they're going to think twice about confronting China on geopolitical differences or territorial issues. And of course, the last thing, which is very important, and this is where the Vision 2025 of Xi Jinping comes in the picture. China wants to make their own technology the global standard. So by building the infrastructure of other countries, they're also exporting their technological standards, and that gives them long-term advantages. So in short, you cannot really separate the economics from politics. The debate really is what will be more primary over the long run. But at this point in time, I think it's flexible enough for China to feel that they can hit two stones, or in my case, hit 7 birds with 1 stone so far. So this is just a general picture. Thank you.
If I can.
Yeah, of course.
That's one heck of a stone. Yeah. I just follow up on this, on the two of you. It sounds, and I have the advantage of being the novice amongst the experts, so I can ask the novice questions. It sounds like a lot of these decisions are made on sound economic principles, right? They're creating jobs for their own, they have overcapacity, industrial capacity, they have, but you hear reports of projects that are white elephants in the hometowns of heads of states in Africa or Asia. You hear reports about taking advantage for military reasons in their own neighborhood. You hear reports about collecting intelligence. Just how do you reconcile both? I know you talk that there are geostrategic and about exporting their own technology, but sometimes you hear about it and you're just flabbergasted. What's going on? Either one of you can answer that.
David first.
Well, I think it's confusing because there's so many different things going on at once.
Exactly.
So there is a modest amount. There's a modest amount of Chinese grant aid, and that's going to be going to building the soccer stadiums and the presidential palace. But that's really a very small number. Most of the big ticket is construction of power and transport infrastructure. And it's mostly coming from China Development Bank. And you could say it's an economic decision. I think they expect to be repaid, but I think they're looking at individual projects, and they're not really looking at the risk of the country risk, the fiscal sustainability. So I think they may be unpleasantly surprised to see that they end up losing money, in quite a few cases. Right. It's a complicated business. It can look like a good project in the sense that you actually build the road, right? But you need to service external debt with exports. And so there's really a macroeconomic analysis of, is this going to generate enough export revenue to service the loan? And you can have a perfectly nice road with lots of cars on it, and you can even have tolls collecting money, but the macroeconomics of it may not very work out, because in the end of the day, you owe dollars to the Chinese institution, and you're collecting local currency on your tolls.
Yeah. Well, one of the fundamental structural problems with the BRI is that there's over-reliance on policy banks. Export-Import Bank of China, China Development Bank, ICBC, so on and so forth. And policy banks, by nature, are not necessarily just going to look at economic feasibility. They're going to put other consideration in the picture. And of course, as I said, there's also aspect of Xi Jinping in trying to portray himself as the guy who will make China once again the center of the world, right? They in fact use the term globalization 2.0, right, in a kind of a Silicon Valley way. So ironically, as I say, it seems suddenly a communist country, nominally communist country, is now putting itself forward as the vanguard of globalization, just as this country goes in a different direction. Now, the other thing is, of course, you can do all the beautiful planning out there, but once you hit the reality of political economy in the developing world, then you have to adjust and make all of those kinds of negotiations, moral negotiations and transactional negotiations. Then, of course, there's also the aspect of what do we really mean by Chinese investment? Because this is a big methodological question. Because there are a lot of private sector who are trying to ride on these kinds of investment.
Chinese private sector.
Chinese private sector, and we saw its recent studies, for instance, by Peterson's Institute, was showing that there was a jump for 12% to 40% of total Chinese investment abroad over the past 5 or 6 years. So a lot of private investors are going out for different reasons. Some maybe want to diversify their investment portfolio. Some are looking for big buck, high risk, high reward situations. And that is why actually over the past year, China is tightening actually capital outflow and trying to put new restrictions, because some of this is because the yield on a lot of these private investments are. So ironically, sometimes the Chinese state affiliated companies make smarter investment than the private sector in the China, right? So this is the interesting thing we have to keep in mind. And then of course, then you have cases whereby clearly the Chinese government comes in and says, talks to the other government, head of leader comes over and says, okay, I'm going to instruct 3 different companies to bid for projects X and Y and Z, right? So you have a clear presence by the state. And then you have other cases whereby semi-private, semi-independent state-owned enterprises make those decisions on their own, right? So it's very difficult to actually break down what exactly is China investment, what is purely private investment. And I think the Chinese themselves are not helping themselves when they try to portray everything as part of BRI. Like I heard there's a BRI in the North Pole also, or something like that, in the moon. So this is the problem, because in Southeast Asia, in countries like the Philippines, when there's strong anti-China sentiment, right, any Chinese investment is seen in a negative way. Or maybe there's a Beijing hand behind it. But my point is that it's also hard for us not to see it that way when the Chinese government portrays all investment as an extension of the BRI, right? So this is where we have a catch-22. So we're trying to develop different methodologies to really separate the most purely private one, which are not necessarily always good, and those are that clearly are G2G deals, and actually the Chinese state has a hand in those kinds of projects. Yeah.
Thank you. I need to ask
yeah, of course. This.
Thank you. I like this game. Now we come to the crux of the matter.